All right, what up, y'all? You know, y'all with AK again, House of I-10. So some major things happening today in the news. If you don't know, the United States Supreme Court issued a major decision in a Louisiana redistricting case that is going to have national consequences. The court struck down a congressional map that created a second majority black district, signaling a shift in how race can be used when drawing political maps. Understand, this isn't just about Louisiana. This decision will influence how states like Florida and Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, all of them will handle their redistricting cases moving forward. So if you didn't know, the Supreme Court struck down Louisiana's map that created this majority black congressional district. Their original map had only one majority black district, despite black residents making up roughly 1/3 of the state population. The court framed the issue as unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. But the practical effect is that states now have more room to argue that race-conscious remedies under the Voting Rights Act goes entirely too far. So what we'll do, we'll get into a quick segment real quick so I can show you all and you hear a little bit about what happened in Louisiana, and I'm going to connect that to how that impacts and affects Florida. So let's get into that.
Have more representation, this population.
Yes, and what the court is holding here, Anna, is that this was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. So you have to ask, are the lines going to be drawn in a way that disperses the votes of African Americans in the state of Louisiana such that their voices will not be heard in the way that we have traditionally understood the Voting Rights Act to support? That's a legitimate question on the table now, how the state is going to redraw these maps in a way that both complies with the Voting Rights Act, but also comports with this court's decision today, an unambiguous decision where you have all 6 of the court's conservatives in the majority, and you have 3 of the court's liberals in dissent. I have yet to read the dissent. We've got 92 pages of decisions here, but this is one that we expected could have large reverberations across the country. And I just want to situate this in the context of some of these larger redistricting fights that are happening across the country. We are seeing a number of states try to redistrict for political reasons, to gain a political advantage. And while we see whether or not, for example, the Virginia maps are going to hold or whether Florida is going to redistrict, this adds a whole new variable into those House maps for the 2026 election. Are states going to now reconsider some of their maps in light of today's decision in ways that could even further throw the balance of power of the House of Representatives into disarray?
All right, so you heard about, they gave a great breakdown of what happened and what impacts this ends up having for our community. So of course, in Florida, our Governor DeSantis has used this national legal opening to push a new congressional map that could move Florida from a 20-8 Republican advantage to a 24-4 advantage, potentially eliminating 4 Democratic seats held Democratic held seats and weakening minority voting influence in key regions. So this is being defended as race neutral redistricting, but people are arguing that outcome dilutes black and minority voting power. And so you see this happening in Georgia now, where Georgia is racing to have its maps also be revised under Section 2 scrutiny. A federal judge struck down Georgia's congressional map in 2023 and ordered a new map after voters argued the state should have created another majority black district in the Atlanta region. So if you understand that black voters are not a small political footnote, Pew found that black eligible voters were projected to reach 34.4 million nationally in 2024. And if you look at our numbers, we're around 44 million in the country. And so when you break this down and you look at what is happening around the country, there are some very important states that we need to understand the numbers on, and we can make this tie and this connection to what is happening, right? So if you look at Texas, when you talk about the black vote and its potential to impact governments and voting around these areas, right? You got 2.9 million black eligible voters in Texas. In Georgia and Florida, you got about 2.6 million. And in Georgia, black voters make up about 33% of eligible voters. So the response, it cannot be silenced. If district lines are going to be drawn to weaken communities, then the communities must respond with organization, registration, turnout, legal awareness, and local engagement. Because the vote is not just a ballot, it is a shield against our erasure. So when we can mobilize and understand, when we break down those numbers and we look at, in the 2018 elections, we had about 1 million people turn out and vote. And then when we got to the 2022 elections in Florida, I'm talking about, then our numbers end up dropping to about 785,000 voters, right? And so that's a decline of 300,000 voters in this state between the midterm elections of 2018 and then 2022. So if remember, I said we got 2.6 million black voters within the state of Florida. So we haven't even maximized and utilized the amount of voters, black voters in our state to its maximum efficiency. There is, when you look at 785,000 voters, there is a large opportunity because we got to close the gap to get to 2.6 million. Those are eligible, right? And so mobilizing voters in this particular situation is the thing that will cause the Republicans' plan and this whole redistricting plan to fall on its face, right? It will backfire, and it can have positive ramifications despite them trying to draw out the districts and try to go from that 20-8 lead to the 24-4 lead. Remember, they have written policies that have upset a large conglomerate of people within the state of Florida. And so there is an opportunity to take advantage of that. They can go ahead and cheat and manipulate, do whatever it is. But if you have strategic efforts to communicate to those who have not been showing up, but then communicate to those whose family members have been impacted and hurt by the legislations and policies that have existed at the hands and at the pen of those at the Capitol writing policies to go against us, and then those in Washington, D.C., the right policies that go against those communities. Those can be the things that give us the edge to be able to win out and to at least level the playing field, despite them trying to manipulate and use these policies, legislations, and things to go against us. Because recognize this already happened, right? So remember, you got to go back to Congressman Al Lawson, who represented Florida's 5th congressional district, which is a historically black performing district stretching from Tallahassee to Jacksonville. That district had been drawn specifically to comply with the Voting Rights Act and to ensure that black voters had a meaningful opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. In 2022, Governor Ron DeSantis pushed through a new map that completely dismantled that district. So the old district was roughly 50% plus black voting age population, and then it leaned Democratic by about 20 to 25 points. But then the new configuration, it split those voters into multiple districts. So in the new map, black voters were dispersed into a majority white district, and then Republican voters were added in much higher proportions, and the replacement district became Republican leaning by double digits. And of course, Representative Al Lawson lost his seat in 2022, but it wasn't because of a shift in voter preference, but because the structure of the electorate was fundamentally changed. This is how Neil Dunn ends up winning and getting that seat, and they're trying to use the same playbook over again to capture those other seats throughout the state of Florida. But remember, in 2022, I gave you the numbers. Don't forget those numbers. There's a huge significant drop from 2018 from 1.088 million to 785,000. So now, not only do we got to get back up to where we was at in 2018, but we still got 1 million plus votes, right? 1 million plus votes to even capture for those who did not turn out and did not show out. Or show up in 2022 election. So then you look at how does this apply to Texas, right? What are they doing? You see what happened with Jasmine Crockett and others have been pointing out where the redistricting is being used as a pre-election mechanism to determine outcomes before votes are even cast. Okay, so you got the Fair Districts Amendments, right? Because remember, this is what makes Florida unique and concerning. So Florida voters passed the Fair District Amendment in 2010. And so it explicitly says that they cannot be drawn to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. So in other words, the legislature is not supposed to draw maps just to help Republicans, Democrats, or sitting office holders. It cannot be drawn with the intent or result of denying racial or language minorities equal opportunity to participate in the political process. This means that maps cannot weaken minority voters' ability to elect candidates or their choice. This is especially important for Black and Hispanic voters in Florida. It must be contiguous, which means each district has to physically connect, and it must be compact where possible, which means districts should not be oddly shaped, of course. It must be as equal in population as feasible, and districts should have roughly equal numbers of people, and it should use existing political and geographic boundaries where feasible. So the legislature should not use redistricting to protect politicians, rig maps for one party, or dilute the voting power of Black, Hispanic, or language minority communities. Now, I hear what you're saying, right? Because there is a policy that is clear that exists within the fundamental framework to protect us against from what is essentially happening now in Florida. Here is the issue. Here it is. So naturally, you will want to handle this in the courts, right? That seems your next level of recourse, the next direction for what you do. But again, this is why it's important to pay attention to the political dynamics and the situation where you are, so that you can at least attack it or at least try to frame it correctly, although it may not still work out in your favor. So remember, Governor DeSantis has appointed 6 out of 7 of the current Supreme Court justices, right? Florida Supreme Court justices. So which means that us or whoever is going to try to take this into litigation is going to be up against a major roadblock, because unfortunately, when you put people on a bench, right, their protections and the way that they should rule should be based off of the language that is in the policy in black and white, right? But there is the strong possibility, but you won't know until you get before the courts and see how they handle this. But if you look at precedent, there is a strong possibility that the political ideology is going to be leaning in the favor of the conservative and the Republicans, which means that they're not going to handle it. It's not going to rule out, and essentially you're going to be stuck with these particular maps until we change. So, but that's the layout, that's the land, that's where we are, right? So the only thing that we can do is we have to turn out. That's what we have to do. Because when they draw lines to divide us, we answer by drawing ourselves back together across neighborhoods, across districts, across differences, with unity and with strategy and with participation. That's what it's going to take for us to kick in the door and to be able to gravitate those that we galvanize, those that we need among us to stick it to them at the elections. But if you don't turn out, if you don't find a way to stop the unnecessary debate and dismantle the disagreement, the unnecessary disagreement between Democrats, then all they're going to do is use the fractures that we have to their benefit. Again, let's break down some of these important numbers, right? So when you look at the midterms, typically they are anywhere between 49 to 55%, right? The outlier was in 2018, though. The outlier, you had 63% of turnout for a midterm election. What was the key thing to that? That was because you had the candidate for governor, you had Andrew Gillum, right? So Andrew was able to mobilize a lot of people to get excited to participate in the election, and you had this high turnout, right? But then afterwards, and even before that, you see what the actual numbers are. And understand this, in the midterm election, it drops off significantly as far as voter turnout, right? So now in 2022 midterms, you got 54% voter turnout. 2024 for the presidential election, you pretty much had 80%. It was 78.9%. So let's just round up and you say 80%, right? So then you go to 2018. Remember, that's the outlier, 63%. In the 2020 election, for presidential election, you had 77%. Midterm election 2014, you got 51% of turnout. And then in the presidential election in 2016, remember that's Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, you get 75%. And then when you go back to 2012 presidential election, you get 72%. But when you look at the midterm elections in 2010, you had 49%. Now, remember what happened in the 2010 election. You had Barack Obama, who was elected in 2008. Turnout was one of the highest. It got even higher in 2012, right? So you had all these people turn out. But then in the midterm elections, look at the drop off. It goes from, when you go to 2010, you look at 49. So look at like 2012. Yeah, when you go to 2012, it goes up to 72% for the presidential election. It goes to 72%. Then you go back to, remember, 2014, it drops down to 51. So if you're running for office, if you are strategizing for what you need to do for these elections and, again, galvanizing people, it's the midterm elections which provides you the most opportunity to close the gaps. That's what you have to pay attention to. If you're running for election, you have to get to the people who do not show up in the midterm elections, bring them out. I know you're thinking about registering new voters. Like even when we talk about registering voters, it is ridiculous how many people you got to register to vote. But then out of the amount of people that you got to register to vote, people just did not either mail in their ballots and show up and vote, or they did not go to the booths and vote. Registration and registering voters is half the battle. The other thing you have to do is get them to the polls. So now in a midterm election, not only do you try to close the gap, I mean, it's a goal here, right? It probably won't happen, but not only do you try to close the gap for participation in presidential elections, but then you also have to close the gap for those who will not show up to vote, but they will register. So that's talking to those voters. Like, that is the strategy that you need. And so I'm looking at something, right? And when you're talking about nationally, black voter turnout, here we go, from 2018, 51% in 2018. Well, I talked about that. 51% in 2018. No, this is national. What I talked about was Florida. So black voter turnout fell from 51% in 2018 to 42% in 2022. I'm just going to let that marinate. That's where this matters. And I try to communicate to people. I try to beat it in their heads, understanding that voting is an individual sport. It's an individual activity to contribute to a collective outcome. So when you got this mindset of that, my vote doesn't count, remember, you are contributing to a pool of individuals. So you could be as separate as the fingers on the hand. But when you vote, that you end up becoming collective and as powerful as a fist. As an individual finger, it's weak. It's not doing too much if you touching and hitting it, you're trying to lift anything. But when the fingers come together, that is where the power is at. We gotta understand that. So here we are. We can't cry about it. Like, we have to strategize about it and understand that they are playing for keeps. Mind you, this all ties into this situation that's going on with the whole DEI thing, right? Where there's an attack on DEI. You see these political narrative shifts. You remember Governor Ron DeSantis has argued that white men are among the most disadvantaged groups in America today. So now you take that and then you connect that to these redistricting efforts. So now you redefine who is disadvantaged. You also then create a new justification for rolling back policies and even legal protections originally designed to protect minorities. Federal contracts. So you look at this, right? The DEI, you look at what happens on the national level. Federal contracts for minority African-American owned companies was awarded at 2.5%. After the DEI invocation and attacks on the DEI, that number for awarded contracts has dropped down to like 1%. So when you're trying to make these decisions on your involvement in voting and turnout, you got to ask yourself, whatever decision you make, how is this going to harm you? And then how is it going to benefit others? That's what we need to have the comparison analysis to. Whatever you decide you're going to do, how is it going to harm you, and then how is it going to benefit others? Because if you see is that it could potentially harm your outcomes, but your analysis paralysis or your lack of participation will then benefit the other group or the other people, then you know you're making a bad decision by sitting on the sideline. So what I'm offering to you is that beyond voting, right? It's the involvement, is getting people out, is getting people involved. It's letting, I have to really appreciate, if you don't know, look at what them students did at South Carolina State, right? South Carolina State, that lieutenant governor was coming to speak for, let me type this in real quick. Was coming to speak. I think her name was Pamela Yvette, right? So she was coming to speak, and them students protested at South Carolina State and was saying, this person does not have our interests at heart. So how are you going to let them stand up there on that podium and talk to us on a day where we are celebrating our bridging from the school environment arena, taking all this that we learned to go out into the workforce and into creating and impacting the environment, and you got somebody who's coming to talk to us that is in complete opposition, diametrically opposed to what it is that South Carolina stands for, what it is that we've talked about in this school, and we're going to go out there and we have to go up against this person that does not align with our values, and they undermine the school's legacy. So this person, she's apparently that was the lieutenant governor out in South Carolina right now. So if you don't know about that story, definitely look into what they did, because this is not the time for standing on the sideline, standing in place. This is the time to mobilize, get involved, and let's go shock the nation, because all eyes are on the state of Florida right now due to this. All eyes are on the state of Florida right now. So that's all I got for y'all. I don't want to keep y'all, but I mean, something had to be said because, just talking about what is going on and how the situation in Louisiana, how it further is gutting and eroding the Voting Rights Act. What they did with Section 2, remember Section 5 has already been dismantled. That's where states like Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, any of those places that historically use intimidation, it had voting or keeping people from out of office that were minorities. Any of those places they had to, before they did anything, they had to submit it to the feds, and then the feds had to look it over before they could move forward with any changes. Of course, that was dismantled and taken out in, I think, Shelby v. Holder in 2013. So now this is another attempt at eradicating further the efforts of what happened. I've said this, if you follow me on my Facebook page, any of that stuff, one of the things that I keep on saying to people is that, you can decide that you don't want to be involved in politics, and you can decide that you don't want to pay attention to it and whatever, right? But one of the things that I say is that you can ignore politics all you want, but politics is definitely going to be involving you, either to your benefit or to your detriment. So whether you like it or not. So I suggest you have some level of awareness and involvement. All right. House of I-10, always bringing you the latest news, especially when it comes to politics, leadership, history, all of that. Appreciate y'all. Peace.